Hello, and welcome back to the Retro Perspective series covering each and every issue of the official PlayStation magazine. This time we have issue number 14 from December of 1996. In the news this issue, Sony had set a release date for the Yaroze development kit, which allowed people to make their own games on the PlayStation. Sort of a homebrew kit, you might say. I don't know much about the software used to create these games, but I assume that you still needed to be a pretty damn good coder, and it was probably nothing like the video game creation tools we have nowadays. The price tag of £600 meant that it probably wasn't for people who just wanted a bit of a fiddle. Also, Yaroze marked the first time that a console manufacturer such as Sony officially supported homebrew and people making their own games for consoles. So far this had been only a PC gaming thing. On the next page, a little preview for Hellraiser here, which is described as Wipeout meets Duke Nukem. However, I'm pretty sure this game never released and I cannot find a single bit of information about it on the internet. This little snippet may be the only information we ever got, but we'll see in the coming issues. New versions of PlayStations being manufactured were set to have chrome optical blocks in them now. This was to help prevent overheating. I can't remember my PS1 ever overheating, to be honest, but I do live in a pretty chilly country. On the next page we have some extremely early screenshots of various games such as Metal Gear Solid 1, and this one in particular I found really cool. It's of the game Theme Park, and it shows that the game started as an isometric view with much cleaner, almost pencil-drawn visuals. It also shows that they were trying to work in different styles of theme park. If you see right at the bottom there, this one's a dinosaur themed one, but that wouldn't be a feature until the sequel, Theme Park World. Around Christmas time nowadays, the UK government claim that they can barely afford to hire celebrities to turn on the Christmas lights across all the UK towns. After all, they'd have a few £100,000 less to spend on champagne for their Christmas parties each year. But for Christmas of '96, Sony was footing the bill and splashing the cash by hiring the Spice Girls, my favourite band at the time. The same year, Leeds had Lisa Riley, long-time Emmerdale cast member. I don't think Sony were involved in that one, unfortunately. Previously, PSM had claimed that Resident Evil 2 would be far more realistic than the first game, with wounds that could potentially affect the character for the rest of the game. Let's see if any of that was walked back on in this preview. If Resident Evil was the game of 1996, its sequel will undoubtedly follow suit in '97. Claire Redfield was nowhere in sight, as players were still set to play as Elsa, whose sole personality trait seemed to be that she rode a motorcycle. The game's producer, Noritaka Funemizu, elucidates, "We've included different costumes for the two main characters, such as fire-resistant suits, and depending on which costume they are wearing, the number of weapons they can carry at any time will vary. This makes some sections much more challenging." Resident Evil 2 is about 1.5 times bigger than the original. The room sizes are about the same as before, but there are far more of them, and there's far greater number of enemies too. In Resident Evil, all the zombies move the same way and at the same speed. This time, each of the zombies has its own pattern, so some will move slowly, while others will suddenly pick up pace and start running at you. It's to keep the player constantly on guard and accentuate the element of surprise. And here we see a rather crazy claim if you take into account how long games take to make nowadays. The producer claims that currently the title is only 40% complete in terms of its engine and graphics. However, the developers envisage that it will see a Japanese release shortly after Christmas. That's in 1 month from this preview. That's pretty crazy. And as we now know, Resident Evil 2 was released just a month later in January of 1998. So it didn't take them a month to complete 60% of the game. It took them a year and a month. Okay, that makes more sense. Maybe the producer was just getting his release dates mixed up, as Capcom were set to release so many games in 1997. It's actually quite crazy when you look at their output today, how many more games they were putting out back then. In development were Super Puzzle Fighter, Marvel vs. Capcom, Mega Man 8, Breath of Fire 3, and at least 2 Street Fighter games, though let's face it, those were probably just upgraded versions of Street Fighter 2. Here's an interesting preview for Sentient. I've not heard much about this game at all, but it looks like an interesting mix of like a sci-fi RPG mixed with an adventure game. Because every decision you make influences the plot, one game can never be the same. Again, that's a really strange wording. I think they mean no 2 games can ever be the same. On the next page, yet another futuristic sports game is making its way to the PS1, and this one's called Riot, although it's called something different in every territory, I believe. This one kinda looks a bit like American football, or soccer as I like to call it, but you get to, of course, beat up other people as it's a future sport. I don't know why people thought that futuristic sports would involve so much violence, but there you go. And you of course get access to a load of power-ups. Here is a rather optimistic preview of Bubsy 3D, hot on the heels of Crash Bandicoot and Pandemonium, so I think they were maybe expecting it to be on the same level as those games. But we'll leave this for now until PSM's review to see what they really thought. As I was reading through this magazine, I noticed that there are some really weird adverts for Adventures of Lomax in this one, and I just think they're kind of bizarre. Like this bit's on page 21, but only Lomax can turn him, and then you read loads of pages, and on page 33 is when the advert actually finishes, where it goes into him. But if you'd forgotten you'd seen the first part, you're just looking at that and thinking, what does that even mean? So we saw a little bit of Wild 9 last month, and they've shared pretty much the same screenshots again here, which in my opinion are just far too early to even have anything said about them. But there is a full 2-page preview here, and the name is still The Wild Nines rather than what it became. The preview itself is just the game's director, Kevin Munro, talking basically a load of absolute bollocks about the game being a 3D platformer, which it's clear from the screenshots that this was never actually a working 3D platformer, and the game didn't turn out to be a 3D platformer either. He says, in a wishful thinking sort of way, it's inevitable that Wild Nines will be compared to other platformers, Sega's Knights and Nintendo's Mario 64, by virtue of the fact that it's a 3D console game. Kevin does, however, allude to perhaps the game's biggest selling point, for me at least, and that's the weapon that the main character has. It's kind of this rope that he can attach to enemies and move them around. But as this has clearly not been implemented into the game in any way at this point, and he's just making shit up off the top of his head, we'll have to leave Wild 9 for now. It seems that with each issue they tried to cram more and more reader letters into the magazine, but I'm sure that they got hundreds and hundreds more than they could ever include. Either way, as usual, I'm going to go over just a couple here, and they will once again be read out by some fellow gaming YouTubers.
How come all PlayStation magazines seem to ignore such things as the FMV problem and inferior quality of power releases? The FMV problem is very real and even rears its head on your cover discs, but to look at any magazine you'd have to wonder what FMV even stands for. Even worse is the dire quality of overhyped games. I refer to the PAL version of Tekken 2, still can't believe you gave it 10 out of 10, and the bugged F1. In gameplay terms alone, Andretti Racing walks all over F1, and yet it seems that most of you have been sucked into the F1 hype factory. This isn't a slagging off of PSM. Magazines are essentially the wider voice of PlayStation owners, and it's about time you started using your position to highlight and amend things like this.
It's true that the big titles are hyped to an unbelievable degree, but we strenuously deny that we are guilty of being taken in by this. We always approach new titles with a more than healthy measure of cynicism. The plain fact is that F1 is an amazing title. We thought so, and so did the thousands of people who bought the game. Not me, but I only bought it for like 50p about 20 years later, so you know. While we rigorously playtest every game we cover, we can't test them for every possible bug that may be present. What's more, there's nothing we can do about lazy PAL conversions. In the case of Tekken 2, we felt that it was the finest 3D beat-em-up we'd ever seen, and we know that the vast majority of fans of the first game would feel the same. You may not like our 10 out of 10 score, but it would have been a greater crime to have done a hatchet job on such a stunning piece of software, just because of a fairly minor problem that afflicts most PAL conversions.
I've been a computer games addict since owning an Amstrad CPC 464 in the mid-80s. From there I progressed to an Amstrad 6128 before taking a mighty leap to a PC 486SX, missing out the 16-bit phase altogether, and now I couldn't be happier with my PlayStation. But I do agree with SW Thieker, PlayStation Magazine issue 9. Those British classics are sorely missed. I remember with great fondness Nightlore, Sorcery, Dragon Torque, Elite, the Level 9 Adventures, Jet Set Willy, Yi Er Kung Fu, etc. Not because of nostalgia, but because they had an inherent playability which was all the more admirable when considering the architecture of the 8-bit computers they were written for. How about a feature in your magazine charting the various evolutions of the 8-bit companies? I get the impression that most PS owners have been 8-bit users in the past, and a little nostalgia never harmed anyone.
Oh, give it a rest, mate. Of the games you mention, the vast majority are pump. Only Elite would survive in a scrap against today's titles. Jet Set Willy was great at the time, but compared to Crash Bandicoot, containing elements perfected over all the years of platform game development, it's a dinosaur. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Shopkeeper, could I have a refund for this crappy Tekken 2 effort? I've just rediscovered an old copy of Yi Er Kung Fu. Not a very likely scenario. A lot of old games are being revamped for the PlayStation now anyway, but can we please stop looking backwards and start enjoying the wealth of superb new games that are being developed? Oh my god, maybe they're right. Maybe I should stop looking backwards and start enjoying the wealth of new games being developed now. No. So I've made it pretty clear that I don't particularly like this F1 game on the PlayStation 1, as of many people in the reader letters, but it was still an insanely popular game at the time and loads of people loved it, and that's why it's got a full feature in this month's magazine. One of the best PlayStation games yet? Sure, but it seems from your comments that Cynosis and Bizarre Creations F1 is also straining the envelope in terms of being one of the most bug-ridden too. According to Glenn O'Connell, Cynosis PR manager, some of the things that people have been complaining about as being bugs are not actually bugs. Trust a PR manager to say that. Part of this problem actually comes from the misrepresentation of the content within the game. From its original concept to the final submission code supplied to Sony, F1 has always been an arcade racer with a wide array of simulation elements. F1 was designed with mass market appeal in mind, and Cynosis simply didn't feel that the current PlayStation market would support a more rigorous simulation. Which brings us to the bug. Some AI cars will continually drive into the pits throughout a race, while others go the whole distance and usually end up winning. This is a genuine problem that became apparent post-launch, although it only comes into effect when the player is playing over a long distance race, with fuel stops turned on. And it should be highlighted that it only happens in a couple of modes, therefore this problem will only be encountered by a small percentage of owners. Many people we've spoken to don't see what the huge fuss is in relation to the wealth of features in the game. Glenn estimates that less than 0.25% of buyers have expressed concern about F1, and is adamant that Cynosis are completely happy with the software. It's a double whammy of features this month, and the next one is a Christmas buying guide, of course. The feature mainly goes over what PSM would recommend if you had certain amounts of money, from £25 all the way up to loads of pounds. If only I had loads of pounds, I'd buy, well, Probably everything that's listed here, actually. Next up, we have the reviews, starting off with a big one. It's Pandemonium. It's taken a while for the really class platformers to start to show themselves on the PlayStation, but after Crash Bandicoot, here comes another one. Pandemonium is an absolutely classic game. Apart from the gorgeous camera angles used throughout, it may not offer much that's genuinely new to this firmly established genre, but who cares when the traditional elements have been so superbly blended together to form a gamer's paradise. The game starts with a splendid FMV sequence introducing the two characters, Nikki and Fargus. They're messing about one night, casting spells from the top of a castle, when they accidentally summon a huge monster who starts devouring the countryside. How can they save the world? By getting to the end of the game, of course. There are some great set pieces in this game. At the end of one level, where you've been patiently climbing stairs all the way, is a huge boulder which starts rolling towards you. To finish the level, you're going to have to make it all the way down the stairs again, without the boulder catching you and turning you into a pancake. A couple of levels later, there's a ginormous slide that you whoosh down. Down you plummet, falling through the air until you crash through an enormous rock surface and land. The noise of your entrance wakes a slumbering dinosaur, and you must immediately start to run away or be trampled. Moments of full-on gaming mayhem like this just take your breath away, all of which would be no good of course unless the game was also well designed. Fortunately, Pandemonium is just that. There are no nasty surprises to which you cannot react, and the levels are designed to stretch your game-playing skills. Pandemonium never requires you to be perfect, just good. It gets a 9 out of 10 from PSM. The only thing that prevents this game from scoring a perfect 10 is that the game is in cheat 3D. While it looks like it's actually possible to move in 3 dimensions, from some of the screenshots here, you'll only ever be using the left and right arrows on your joypad. Once again, PSM showing here that people were so obsessed with 3D at this time that they were willing to overlook great games just because they weren't in full 3D. But nowadays, when we've seen the resurgence of classic platformers, especially in the indie gaming scene, you can see that, a game like Shovel Knight, as a random example, could easily be seen as a 10 out of 10 game. Doesn't matter that it's 2D, that's just like a ridiculous excuse basically. In the days of yore, Gremlin spent many a happy hour scooting along in a sporty Lotus. Now they'd like us to truck off. Hardcore 4x4 finally gave PlayStation 1 owners the opportunity to scramble off-road in pickup trucks. Having said that, however, this is more of your straight down the middle racer. You line up against 5 other off-road vehicles and bash your way around a given circuit. Mechanically, Hardcore 4x4 is phenomenal. There are 6 different vehicles from which to choose, each most suited to a particular course or surface, of which there are 6 also. They've all got these huge wheels and enormous suspension to help them over treacherous terrain, and they look realistic too. You've probably seen them on those Guinness Book of Records programs with David Frost. The vehicle controls are pleasingly responsive, and despite the terrain, you always feel that you've at least a chance of negotiating the circuit. Those that find the steering too responsive can adjust it accordingly. Hardcore 4x4 gets a 7 out of 10. So last month we saw from the magazine that even Capcom were giving in to this new 3D fighter phase that the games industry was going through. Capcom wanted to go head to head with Tekken and Toshinden with their own Star Gladiator, which was a brand new IP. After being force-fed a steady stream of one-on-one 3D beat-em-ups until they have polygons coming out of their ears, most PlayStation owners would have a hard time mustering up any enthusiasm for another addition to this genre. However, Star Gladiator has been causing a bit of a stir, not because of any groundbreaking innovations, but on account of its developers. Despite the game's exquisitely rendered opening animation, graphically Star Gladiator is disappointing. The backgrounds are a strange mix of polygons and bitmaps, and it doesn't quite come off, though there are some interesting visual effects. The glowing blades of the weapons are nice, and they even leave a glowing trail, as in Soul Edge. The characters themselves are blocky but colourful, a combination of Toshinden and Zero Divide. The reason for their blockiness becomes apparent when they start to move, as their weapons act as a light source and are constantly casting shadows and creating highlights. Their movements are a combination of sharp aggressive actions with a smattering of motion captured fluidity added at dramatic opportunities. Gameplay wise, Capcom have cribbed shamelessly from just about every 3D fighting game on every platform. The result most closely resembles a speeded up version of Soul Edge. Nevertheless, Star Gladiator gets an 8 out of 10 from PSM. A game I really enjoyed playing back in the day was Ready to Rumble Boxing, and here's a game that I think I need to pick up because it seems like a similar concept. Victory Boxing gets an 8 out of 10 from PSM. The first thing you do is create a gym which is saved to your memory card. Each gym can contain up to 8 boxers, so the next step is to create a fighter. The height and weight together also determine the boxer's style. Finally, you name your fighter and set his or her beginning values in 3 vital statistics: speed, power and stamina. These work on a slider system, so making the fighter faster means they won't be as strong or as fit. To start, you'll be ranked 31 in the world, and the basic aim is to reach number 1, becoming the world champion. Your first fight is always against the fighter ranked 30, but after that you normally get to choose which boxer to challenge. Beat him or her and you take their place in the rankings. Lose and you stay where you are. Finally, you end up in the ring itself. This is displayed in glorious 3D and can be viewed from one of 12 different cameras. The key to Victory Boxing lies in the 3 bars at the bottom of the screen. The top one shows the boxer's current damage. When this reaches 0, over they go. The middle bar shows the boxer's current power. Throwing punches tires you out, so you need to take a break now and then. Finally, the bottom bar shows overall stamina. This is drained slowly to replenish the other 2. If it runs out, you'll be knocked out. Although the controls take some time to get to grips with, once you've mastered them, they're quick and responsive. What really makes the game though is the fighting itself. You can't charge in fists flying and win. You have to consider strengths and weaknesses, timing attacks and defences carefully. In short, you have to box. Carefully managing your fighters, training them up as they progress, is strangely compelling. In the long term, Victory Boxing offers a lot of satisfaction. Up next is a point and click adventure by Crystal Dynamics, which clearly wanted to be Discworld, but unfortunately didn't quite live up to those high expectations. 5 minutes of moving from location to location was enough to convince the 5-year-old we'd roped in to help with the research that Tomb Raider was much more fun to watch. The cartoon graphics lost their appeal almost immediately. The language was way too complex and the puzzles too obscure to appeal to this age range. Older children will understand the language and puzzles, but they're not going to find it any more enjoyable because it's just so flat. Blazing Dragons gets a 5 out of 10. Before EA Redwood Shores took over and made the amazing NASCAR Rumble, which unfortunately was a US exclusive, there was NASCAR Racing 96, a very run-of-the-mill title which suffers badly in comparison with classics like Ridge Racer Evolution. Primitive graphics, grating sound, lacking gameplay, and lazy presentation. That sounds like a modern EA game. On the next page we have a 2 out of 10 game, which I think is the lowest score we've seen so far. It's Player Manager. The facts are all wrong. Playing this season, 96-97, as Bristol Rovers, gasheads will be horrified to discover they've been relegated to the 3rd division. Oh well, let's play last season, 95-96 then. What do you mean Huddersfield are still in Division 2? They were promoted to the 1st at the end of the season before, by beating Bristol Rovers in the playoff final, and good though Rovers are, it's unusual to find 6 of your 3rd division team on international duty. I have no clue what I just said. Inaccuracies may be annoying, but they don't necessarily mean the death of a game. Poor control methods help that. The game's designed to be used by the mouse or a joypad, and since there aren't that many mouse owners out there, we played the game with the joypad. What a pain in the arse it is too. Tedious minutes wasted trying to get your little ball cursor from one side of the screen to the other. Frankly, Player Manager is pump. It's full of annoying half-hearted features that get in the way. It wastes your time with dreadfully presented stats that do little to affect your decisions, and some of the in-game sketches are appalling. Not to mention the poor match highlights, where it looks like the players have lead weights strapped to their feet. The first football management game it may be, but they can only become more user-friendly, more accurate and more enjoyable if this is the start point. In last month's previews I was feeling like this game might be a little hidden gem, but unfortunately it only gets a 6 out of 10. This is Floating Runner. Most of the game revolves around trying to figure out how to get from one floating blob to another, while avoiding the unwanted advances of evil creatures. It's that straightforward. On a positive note, there is a real sense of space and three-dimensionality about the game's surreal floating landscapes. Although Floating Runner is based on a style of game which is ages old and fundamentally 2D, the backgrounds are all true 3D, and looking over the edge of each platform gives a convincing sense of perspective. Floating Runner also has these token Japanese touches, which have made Nintendo's games so distinctive. The main characters are cute and simple, and so are the baddies. There are loads of different stages, each offering a slightly different graphical style, and some providing engaging puzzles, but the whole thing lacks polish. The next few pages sees more fairly poorly reviewed games, Power Move Pro Wrestling, Smash Court Tennis, and Namco Museum Volume 2. But then XCOM Terror from the Deep smashes it out of the park with an 8 out of 10. That's the same score they gave to the original. Anyone familiar with the first XCOM can play the sequel without even opening the manual. The game structure is the same, the aims are the same, heck the front end and menus are identical. There are some changes for the better. Missions now take place on dry land and underwater, so the in-game graphics have all changed. Thankfully the action is also a tad quicker, although the loading times inexplicably are even longer. The operation is now divided into more varied missions, sorties to take place at docks around the world, on board ships, and in alien colonies. Several tweaks have also been made to the music and sound effects to enhance the ambience, and it seems to be a damn sight harder too. Sadly, it's just not enough. XCOM Enemy Unknown was barely state of the art a year ago, and now TFTD looks even more out of place compared to the recent 3D fests of Tekken 2 and Tomb Raider. Again, just banging on about the 3D. XCOM couldn't be further from Tomb Raider if it tried. Okay, the last review we'll cover in this magazine is Firo and Claude. It's an isometric game. I don't know if isometric games are considered fake 3D, as the magazine keeps putting it, but either way it gets a 5 out of 10. There's this dog detective and this law-breaking punk cat who are working together on a case. They're walking down the street when one of them pulls out a gun and starts to open fire on some armed criminals who have appeared in front of them. Anyway, because the graphics are all isometric, the player finds it incredibly difficult to accurately fire at the enemies, so more often than not he misses, taking a load of bullets to the gut in the process. The next game, the same two are walking down the street, and this time the player realises he has to use a system of ducking and shooting to get through relatively unscathed. After walking a few blocks he decides to try out a new system. This time he just walks straight through the level, only opening fire when it's absolutely unavoidable. Starting to sound like Resident Evil 6. Next time the player comes across a little bridge thing made of planks, but the 3D is so bad that he falls off and dies again. Once again there's no passwords or memory option. Eventually the player thinks this is ridiculous and phones up the developer to ask how he can save his position. After a pause the developer clears his throat and says, "Here's the punchline, you can." Very strange writing style this reviewer has here. And of course the magazine closes with its top secret cheats section, and this time we have part 2 of Tekken Techniques, a full list of every special move of every character in Tekken 2. And that about does it for the official PlayStation Magazine number 14. Some mixed reviews in this issue, but also some bangers as well, and quite a few games that I had actually never even heard of, and we had one game that no information can be found about at all. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Jake of the Retro Perspective, and I'll see you next time.